Okay, I've got 6 o'clock, so we might have a few more people joining us. We had several more that had registered, but maybe they're just going to watch the recording, or they might join us a little bit late. My name is Phil Cox, not Becky Holbert, as you might see in the picture. That's just who our Zoom is licensed to in Vermilion County Extension Office. So myself and Kurt Landzone, back in late February, we started a series on spring gardening. Of course, before this COVID hit, we were able to get a couple of them in before COVID, and we canceled a couple of them. And this one we decided to do virtually, since we're not allowed to meet as a Purdue extension until the end of June, unless things go well, and then we can meet in July according to some rules. But anyway, me and Kurt would like to welcome Bob Bruner. He's the extension educator from Owen and Clay counties for Agriculture and Natural Resources. And he's going to tell us all about ticks, the truth about bugs, ticks, so everything we wanted to know, and probably more than what we want to know, including some about Lyme disease. So if you could hold your questions, but you can go ahead and type them in on the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end. So go ahead and take it away, Bob.
So thanks for having me, Kurt and Phil. I just kind of wanted to start out by saying the title is a little bit of a misnomer. Bugs are a general term that people like to use to describe anything creepy crawly that has an exoskeleton. But for an entomologist like myself, bug is actually used to describe a particular kind of insect. In this case, it just makes a nice little title, and it's also, I'm making it a part of a series that I'm doing that I've been posting on our YouTube channel for Clay and Owen counties. And if you're interested in a link to that, I'd be more than happy to give you that at the end of the program. So tonight we're getting together to talk a little bit about ticks. I did a decent amount of research on this, and I will warn you, this will not be an exceptionally long program because that information is somewhat limited. But we're going to go over just a few of the tick species that we have here in Indiana. We're going to talk a little bit about where they occur and what they're doing. And we're going to talk also a little bit about some of the diseases they cause. Now, I will preface this by saying I am not a medical expert, so I can only go in so far as what the CDC has published and other health organizations like Mayo Clinic. I also want to say that the images and the information that you see here, I cannot credit except for one of them, and you'll probably figure out real quick which one. These images come from extension services like North Carolina and Penn State, as well as Purdue University. And a large amount of the medically oriented information comes from the CDC and the Mayo Clinic. And if you have any questions about that or would like direct links to that, I can always get you those after the program. So let's get rolling here. What are a few of the ticks that we deal with here in Indiana? Well, this will advance the slide like I want it to. All right, so the first one, this is one that we only see somewhat often, especially if you tend to go out in the woods. You'll find these on deer and other mammals, the black-legged tick. This is a native of Indiana. And one of the things that you'll note is that all of the ticks I'm going to be talking about have the exact same behaviors. There is no real variation there. Every single tick that I'm going to bring up tonight is a parasite, and that means that they need a host animal in order to survive. Almost every single tick that we're going to talk about, all of its life stages are parasitic. And I'm going to show you a little bit of those life stages in just a moment. One that we are all very familiar with is the American dog tick, and we have this all over Indiana. It is very aptly named. It will very readily attack our companion animals, dogs, working dogs, what have you. And they will attack humans, as you could see this tick searching for a potential bite site on a human host. There's one more tick that we also have here in Indiana, and this one is very cosmopolitan. which means that it is very widespread all across the United States. And that is the Lone Star tick. And this one is very easily identified. Let me just circle back a little bit here. The black-legged tick that I brought up first has these very obvious darkly colored legs. That trait stays very strong. The scutellum, or the very top of its back there, right behind its head, will always be darkened in color. The American dog tick has a scutellum, that same plate on its back, that's kind of a mottled color, but the body and the legs will be that deep red. And then the Lone Star tick, its obvious trait is that it has a yellowish mark right in the middle of its back. Now, the thing to watch out for when you're trying to figure out what tick is biting you is if the tick is engorged with blood. And if it's been feeding, if you've ever seen a tick that's fed for a while, it will look very strange and very nasty. Their bodies will fill up with blood that they've drank, and they'll look like this ugly gray thing from another world. They're just very unpleasant to look at. And that can make it sometimes kind of hard to tell what species of tick you're dealing with. So go by these traits that I've just told you about: the blacklegs, the black-legged tick, the mottled scutellum of the American dog tick, or this very particular yellow spot on the Lone Star tick. Those will be ways to be able to tell. Now, you may ask yourself, why does it matter? Why do I care what kind of tick is biting me? Well, as we go through this program, some of the diseases that get transmitted by ticks are related directly to the species of tick that you are dealing with, and that's going to be very important. So here's just a little bit of information on the life cycle of the various ticks that we have in Indiana. Almost all of them follow the same pattern. You will find eggs that have been deposited in the spring. These eggs will hatch into very, very tiny larvae that will begin to parasitize very small mammals, such as mice or maybe birds, and they will slowly start to grow into a nymphal form. Now, that nymphal form is usually what we refer to as seed ticks, the very, very tiny ticks that can get on you, and when you get hit by a lot of them at once, it can be really difficult to remove them. When I was a graduate student, we worked at a research station that was just totally infested with ticks, and the numbers of seed ticks that I've had to pull off myself and people I've worked with is just, it's incredible, especially if you're in an area where there are a lot of them. Now, these seed ticks are actually preferentially trying to find small mammals and birds, squirrels, rabbits, that kind of thing. But a human being will do. As they begin to grow, feeding on blood, they'll develop through the summer and molt into an adult form. Now, that adult form is the big tick size that you normally see. And they're feeding on things like deer, like livestock, any companion animals you take with you. And eventually those adults will feed, they will mate and lay eggs, and those eggs will overwinter until it is springtime. And then they're going to hatch out again. Now, some species, the adult will survive over the course of the winter, and then it will lay its eggs. It's just dependent on the species. So the big question about ticks is, how do they find us? How do they know what to look for? Now, one thing about a tick is they don't have much in the way of eyesight at all. They are simply a feeding machine. That head you see on their bodies, the only purpose behind it is to have something that it can inject into the skin of its host to draw blood. Most of the sensory information that a tick gets are in these big legs you see on the picture. You can see them kind of always in this kind of Y shape in front of their head. This is a part of one of their behaviors that they do to try to find hosts. And let's make sure I'm not running over myself and see what's on the next slide. So what happens is when a tick is holding up those two front legs, those sensors are going off and they're detecting odors, they're detecting carbon dioxide, moisture, namely like the sweat that's on our skin. But our ticks aren't only just hunting humans, they're hunting other prey as well. So they may be detecting particular chemicals associated with deer, or those associated with dogs or rabbits. They're just trying to find the scent of the things. If we go back what I just showed you here, you can see that this tick, this Lone Star tick, is sitting on a leaf. What he's doing is he's holding up these legs in front of him, and he's just going to wave them around in a behavior called questing. And the minute something walks by his leaf and brushes against it, he's going to use his legs to grab onto his new host. And that is how they get on us. You'll see plenty of images where different animals will be infested. It won't necessarily be in the spots where they latch on. Ticks want to find an ideal bite size, or bite site, I'm sorry. Now, nymphal and larval ticks, they're not going to be on leaves. They're too small to climb yet. They like to stay on the ground so that way they can stay protected against predators. So if you run into a seed tick, most likely it's because you were on the ground and that's when you got infested. But the adult ticks, that is when you're going to be walking through tall grass or maybe a forest understory. They're going to get on your jeans and on your shirt, and they're going to climb into your clothing to be able to find the best spots to feed. Now, some people may say, but wait, I was just walking through some tall grass and now I have all these itchy bites. I think I have seed ticks on me. Not necessarily. There is another type of arthropod, another type of animal similar to a tick called a chigger. And we're all pretty familiar with chiggers if you've ever been bitten by them. They will sit on leaves as immature insects, or not insects, I'm sorry, arachnids in this case, and they will crawl onto the host and they'll create these very itchy, painful bites. So a chigger is something much different from a tick. It won't follow the same rules, and the removal of them also won't be the same as what you would do for a tick. Now, some of the hosts we've already talked about a little bit, but what we most commonly see for most ticks is that they're going to be going after, as adults at least, larger animals. Animals that have surface area they can use to be able to get blood. And that means softer tissue that needs to be available to them. If there's something that has really thick fur on its body, that tick is really not going to be that interested. Unlike lice, which are insects, a tick really doesn't have the capacity to go through thick hairs to be able to reach the skin underneath. They want the easy stuff that's right on top, that is very thin tissue, that has plenty of blood running through it. Thus, why I mentioned deer and other animals. Deer have these large ears that has nice thin tissue. If you've ever gone hunting and you've shot a deer, most likely if you've done it at the right time of year, or if you found one in your woods that was dead, you may have seen that its ears were just infested completely with ticks. There's also rabbits, who you can see very easily on this picture why they would favor rabbits. Rabbits' ears are very, very flush with blood because they're used to redistribute heat for the rabbit. And it makes a very easy source for a tick to get in there, get its bite in, and get a full blood meal so it can lay eggs. And of course, the other thing that you have to consider if you're like me is that your pets are also at risk. What the one in the back there, the orange one, we had to remove ticks out of his paws and his ears when we first got him. They will very readily go after your dogs. If you have dogs that are working dogs that help you in the field, you need to be checking their paws, their ears, sometimes even their noses and their chins to make sure that they don't have ticks on them, because they will latch on very easily to those parts of the dog. Even if your animals are only companion animals, when you take them out on a walk during the summer, you need to make sure that you have not gotten ticks on them. So to give you an idea of how a tick actually does its work, it's a little bit more complex compared to other blood-feeding animals. When we talk about, say, a mosquito, it's pretty straightforward. The mouth parts of a mosquito are just a needle that injects into your skin. However, with a tick needs to be able to hold on to its host and stay there for a long time. Because when it's done feeding on you, most likely that tick is going to die. It is feeding on you in order to get its blood meal and lay its eggs. It is just there to make sure that it can complete that part of its life cycle. So what you're looking at now is a drawn image of its head. And this is actually something done by an entomologist at Purdue University. And it's a very, very good graphic of it. So if you look at the parts of the tick here that are labeled a pout, This is a very funny part that we as mammals don't have. We have an equivalent one, we call it our tongue. A palp is just that, it's a tasting organ, and it can move around like a pair of little fingers. It can't grab anything on a tick. However, if you compared it to another animal, say a scorpion, the big claws you see on a scorpion are just palps that have evolved to be different things. In the case of a tick, this is just for tasting where it's going. It wants to find that right spot, and it's going to use those tiny little palps to find it. The object there labeled chelicera, that funny C, the C word right there. This is a unique thing about a tick. Ticks are very closely related to arachnids. They belong to the same group of animals. Chelicera are kind of like jaws. They use these to, if in the case of a spider, to move their fangs and to be able to drain their prey. In the case of a tick, the chelicera are used to cut a hole into the skin of their host. Unlike a mosquito, they don't have a syringe there. They need to actually make that opening and cut a hole in, kind of like being bitten by, say, a deer fly or a horse fly. Now, the part of the tick there that's labeled a hypostome, this is what is really the true challenge for those of us trying to get rid of ticks. A hypostome is the anchoring portion of its mouth parts. If you look at the image on the right-hand side, you can see that it has these little scale-like bits that are all kind of pointed downwards and away from the end of the hypostome. Well, the reason for that is once it's cut a hole into the skin of its host, it's going to jam the hypostome in there and drain blood through it. And those little scale parts there are like anchors or fish hooks. They're anchoring themselves into the tissue of the host, making it very difficult to remove them. This is why whenever you remove a tick, you want to do so by grabbing its head with a set of tweezers right at the base and use slow but steady force to remove it out of your skin. The parts of its mouth aren't going to hurt you. They're too tiny. But it's very easy for them to break off, and you could potentially get an infection if those parts remain behind. Don't worry about the the arachnid doing more damage to you. It's not going to cut you even more. The hole that it makes is going to be fairly tiny. You're not going to do more damage to yourself. Just remember, use that slow, steady force. Now, the questions that I get very, very often in my line of work are about diseases that can be spread by insects and their relatives. One of the big ones that people ask me about concerning ticks is the disease known as Lyme disease. Unfortunately, there are very few good things to say about Lyme disease. This is spread by a bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi. This bacteria is very hard to kill in some regards because oftentimes you're not aware that you have been infected with it. What we've been taught in the past is that when a tick bites you and infects you with this bacteria, you will often see a rash develop at the bite site. The rash will slowly begin to grow and it'll be hot and red, though not painful, over the course of several days. Eventually, the rash will develop into kind of a bullseye pattern. And you can find plenty of pictures online to be able to see what that looks like. The problem is that this rash doesn't occur in everyone who's been infected, which means that you can get bitten by a tick and you may never actually see that rash occur. Now, when you become infected, the things that we do know that happens is that you can get a lot of different symptoms. Fever, chills, headache and fatigue, muscle and joint aching, which is a very common and very pronounced symptom of Lyme disease, as well as swollen lymph nodes. And this is the stuff that begins to happen at the early stage of it. Now, what I would point out here is that most likely, if you've been infected with something, say COVID-19, you may not be able to discriminate between these symptoms. The good thing is that in the research that I've been doing, there is no indication that ticks are able to spread COVID-19. Research is still ongoing. We're going to wait and see what our medical researchers say But as far as we can tell right now, ticks will not spread COVID-19. Long term, if you've been infected with Lyme disease, there are a host of problems that you could experience. Ongoing nerve pain, endless headaches, inflammation throughout your body in various sections of your body. Many things can be associated with this. So what I would strongly recommend you do is that if you have been bitten by a tick and you begin to feel unwell, contact your physician. Don't try to wait this out for a month or something like that. Go ahead, make sure that you get help. Don't try to soldier on through it. You may have heard of lots of different cultural figures, pop stars who have talked about getting a Lyme disease infection, how it affected their life. Don't let that happen to you. If you get bit and you feel bad, get checked up by your doctor. Now, the bad thing about ticks is that they spread a lot of diseases. Not too many of them represent a lethal threat to human beings, but they can represent something that will make you very sick for an extended period of time. So it's important to self-monitor. If you are someone who's going to be working in an environment where you are going to be encountering ticks and you begin to feel unwell, you need to consider seeing a physician, because this whole host of illnesses are things that can hit you. Many of them you can find here in Indiana. They just aren't very common. Anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis, rickettsiosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever will not occur in Indiana. You'll find that more towards the east. However, all of these things have the slight potential to occur, with anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis probably being the other two, other than Lyme disease, that can occur in Indiana. And again, I would encourage you, if you have questions on this one, check out the information the CDC has available. Check out what different hospital organizations have available. Some of this I found at the Mayo Clinic website and I found interesting. And if nothing else, give us a call and we can help you find it. Now, the other question that I get, and this one was actually something I got to learn a little bit about in the last couple of weeks, is what is referred to as alpha-gal syndrome. This is a rather interesting illness. This is spread only by the bite of the Lone Star tick. Remember when I was showing you how to identify tick species? Only the Lone Star tick can cause this to occur. What happens is when the Lone Star tick bites you, it can insert a sugar molecule into your body called alpha-gal. And what happens to some people, not all, some people, is that when alpha-gal is introduced to their body, they will have an allergic reaction to it. And unfortunately, that allergic reaction will then begin to occur when you consume red meat. You will experience what's called anaphylaxis, your body having an extreme allergic reaction to something. It will not occur in everyone who has been bitten by a Lone Star tick. I cannot tell you the number of Lone Star ticks that have bitten me, and trust me, I still like my steak as much as the next guy, but it is a possibility. So this is something to keep in mind. Talk to your doctor if you feel like this has happened to you. Don't rely entirely on internet research. And keep in mind that this will only come from a Lone Star tick. So if you get bit by a black-legged tick, you don't have this to worry about. I wanted to put up another picture of my dogs. They make me happy. I did put this up for another reason, though. So some of these diseases are shared by our animals. If you have companion animals or working animals with you, a lot of the illnesses that strike us can also strike them. Lyme disease, ehrlichiosis, anaplasmosis, all of these things can hit our favorite dogs. This is why it's very important. Not only do you want to check yourself when you go outside, you want to check your companion animals. Don't treat it as though, oh, it won't happen to me. My grass is only a little bit tall right now, it should be fine. Give them that check. They can't tell you when they don't feel good. So make sure that you know that you've taken the ticks off of them and just kind of monitor them, especially during the summer months when those adult ticks are out and getting on them. Unfortunately, ticks also attack our livestock. Now, thankfully, in the United States, tick-borne illness is not the threat that it used to be amongst a lot of our livestock. There were issues before. There is a type of tick known as a cattle fever tick, and it was spreading a fatal disease amongst cattle livestock. But we recognize that, and our government and farmers work together to eradicate the presence of this tick, and there have been no known reports of it except in very small pockets throughout the United States. So that is not a concern right now. However, the ticks can potentially introduce infection. They can potentially introduce a few milder diseases that don't necessarily mean that they will be fatal, or they can cause anemia if livestock has a strong enough infestation on their bodies. Speaking of anemia and what can cause it, we do have a new invasive species to be concerned about. This is known as the Asian longhorn tick. This is, like it says, a native of Asia, and it does not spread any disease. However, it is very, very unique in that it has a very truncated form of reproduction. It's able to reproduce through a process known as parthenogenesis. What this means is that while they will reproduce sexually, just like human beings will, they also have the ability, when there are no males present, to reproduce by one female creating her own daughter clone, an exact clone of her that she just gives birth to or lays eggs and those eggs hatch. Now, the reason I bring this up after going through livestock is that they can reproduce very, very rapidly. If you have ever dealt with something like an aphid infestation in your garden or on your trees, you'll notice that you'll go out one day and you might have 10 aphids, and then you go out the next day and you now have 150. That is parthenogenesis. This is holding true for this species of tick. You'll see a few on the ear of a cow one day, you'll go out the next, and you'll find 150. Now, the Asian longhorn tick hasn't been very reported throughout the United States yet. There is no evidence that it is yet here in Indiana that I was able to find. But as with most invasive species, most likely it will get here eventually. So we need to monitor for this particular arachnid. If you think that you have found one or are worried about it, contact your local extension educator. If they don't know what it is, I guarantee you they will email me so we can work together and find out what it is. That rapid reproduction that tick does that I talked about can be so intense on livestock that it can actually kill some livestock by just inflicting anemia, drinking so much blood that they deplete all the iron in their bodies. It would take quite a bit of time for cattle to be able to see a result like that, but smaller livestock like goats, sheep, a few other things, you might be seeing some potential problems there. There are diseases that the Asian longhorn tick can spread, though we have not seen evidence yet that they spread diseases like Lyme disease. I think that it's going to be a little bit of time before that information gets through. So just be on the lookout, especially if you have livestock. So of course, one of the things that you all wanted to come here for this evening, how do we protect ourselves from ticks? This is not an easy challenge to face. Ticks are small. They are what entomologists refer to as dorso-ventrally flattened, which means that they're flattened just like a piece of paper. And that helps them be able to crawl into very tight crevices, to be able to get past fur, to be able to get into clothing and feed on us. So what's the best solution to protect yourself? Yes, that is a roll of duct tape. What we did when I was a grad student, like I was telling you about, is we followed the basic principles of protecting yourself against a tick. What you'll hear is that the best way to do it if you're in an area where you know there are ticks is to tuck the cuffs of your pants into your socks, to make sure your shirts are completely tucked in, to wear long sleeve shirts. Now, this does work if you have mild infestation areas, and I suspect a lot of us do. If you're in an area where you have a heavy infestation, like when I was a grad student where we worked, we not only tucked our clothes in, but then we also went to those spots where they were tucked in and we duct taped them up. Because ticks are very, very good at getting past the obstacles we throw in their way. Ticks will strike in very particular places too. Like I've been saying throughout this program so far, ticks like to go for spots where there's very thin tissue and there's blood running close to the surface of your skin. So this can be places such as behind our ears, in our armpits, but also, unfortunately, areas around our groins, where our belt may sit on our pants because it's pushing it closer to the skin. Obviously something very uncomfortable that we don't like to think about, which is why tucking in these portions of your clothing, maybe even throwing some duct tape on them if they're work clothes, is something worthwhile. You want to make sure that even if you do all these things, check and recheck as you work. There is nothing more unpleasant than going home after 8 hours of hot and sweaty work and then getting in the shower and finding 2 or 3 ticks on you. You want to keep trying to check to minimize the presence of ticks. Unfortunately, most human beings bear at least some allergy to ticks. So if you get bitten, depending on who you are, the bite sites can itch for a very long time. Once I got bitten by a tick several years ago, and the actual bite site had healed, but it continued to itch for months afterwards. And this can be true for a lot of people. Hopefully you aren't those people. Another thing that you can do is, if you're looking at your lawn, keep it mowed down. Remember, as I said, ticks like to use leaves of plants to be able to reach out and grab onto their hosts. If you keep your grass mowed and keep it nice and low, not too low, you don't want to kill your grass, but keep it low, that will help control that tick population. It'll also help with several other pest animals too, and hopefully cut down the number of groundhogs and other animals that could be causing problems on your property. And of course, one of the things that we always talk about is try to use a repellent to prevent the presence of the tick. Now, several repellents will work on ticks, chemicals containing DEET, picaridin, oil of eucalyptus is one thing that can also work. I'm sure a lot of you have seen several essential oil products advertised, and while many of them do have repellent properties and they will work, they don't have the longevity that DEET or picaridin will have. DEET is known to work for up to 8 hours, and that's actually been proven through research that I've found, whereas many of the essential oil products will work, but only for as much as 2 hours. So depending on what you want to do and your feelings on using DEET or other chemicals, you may just want to keep this in mind. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea to use essential oils, but you have to realize that you're just not going to get as much protection out of them. Now the last thing, oh, I made a mistake there, I'll fix that later. The last thing that I want to talk about is another way that we want to protect ourselves is by controlling habitats. Now, to me, the actual application of pesticide to a habitat is kind of an extreme measure to try to control ticks. I know that some properties can have some very bad problems, and it may be your last resort in some cases. So I wanted to at least address this a little bit. Now, habitat treatments, if you're going to follow a program of control or an integrated pest management program, should target the right areas. Ticks aren't going to be up in the trees, they're not going to be on bare ground, they are going to be on foliage that is surrounding pathways, places where animals have been making trails, places where you have been making trails. These are spots where ticks are going to be present. The woodlot out back that is just filled with vegetation that you've never been through and nothing has made a trail in yet probably is not going to have much in the way of ticks. Now, there are several chemicals that you can use to attempt to treat for ticks. Bifenthrin, permethrin, and a whole host of other ones. But the availability and the ability to use those chemicals is going to be dependent on your state or sometimes even your county, depending on what they do for their own control measures. I would consider, before doing any kind of habitat-wide treatment for ticks, consult the EPA, consult state regulations, and contact your local extension educator. It is our job to make sure that you have the knowledge to be able to treat for these things effectively and safely. The last thing that I would suggest too is contact an actual professional, a pest control operator or business. Don't try to do this on your own. Any chemical that can kill an arachnid or an insect can harm you as well. Our nervous systems aren't that much different from theirs, and there are only a few exceptions of chemicals that you can apply that won't affect humans. And of course, many of those pesticides that you apply may not just affect ticks, they could also affect beneficial organisms that you don't want to get rid of. So please, if you're considering some kind of habitat-wide treatment, contact a professional, contact your extension educator. All right, folks, that is what I had for you this evening. I know it's kind of a gross subject in a lot of ways, but I hope you learned something, and I'm more than happy to take your questions. Phil, I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I was muted. Really appreciate that. And thank you for that new and interesting information. I do not see any questions in the chat box, but if anybody has a question and they don't want to type in the chat box, just go ahead and unmute your mic and you can go ahead and ask a question or two or however many you have.
Or if you just have questions in general about insects or other creepy crawlies, please feel free. I've gotten several questions about the so-called murder hornet and all kinds of things. Don't be shy.
Now's your chance. Speak now or ask us later.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you did such a good job that you already answered our questions. Okay, very good. Well, like Bob said, if you do have any questions that you think of later, you can contact him in Clay or Owen County. It might be kind of hard to track him down, or you can track down me or Kurt in Park County. Well, here's a question here, Bob.
Yep, I see it. Mary, so you're asking what percentage of people bitten by ticks actually do get a disease? It's fairly small. We don't have a large presence of Lyme disease in our state right now, though some other states do have it. And it's also based on how readily the tick populations in your area get the diseases themselves. Some of them are more likely to get some than others. And right now, it's not a significant portion of them currently that have the ability, at least in Indiana, to spread those diseases. Honestly, if you were going to worry about some kind of arthropod that was going to spread a disease, mosquitoes would be the ones that I would look at before I'd look at ticks.
Okay. Okay, well, this has been recorded. I'll send out a recording. And Bob, you said you had some information that you were going to provide links to.
Yeah, what I can do is I can email Phil a couple of links to like the CDC and Mayo Clinic websites and a few things from a few extension services. And Phil, I can get you those in the morning and email them over to you so folks can get them if they want.
Okay, that'll be great. And then I'll share it with everybody that has registered, including the folks that viewed it live here tonight. Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Bob. We really appreciate it. And there are no further questions. And thank you, Mary, for your comments. Great session.
Thank you very much. You guys have a good night.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thanks, Bob.